Verse in the Old Testament, Proverbs chapter 22. Verse 28. Do not remove the ancient landmark which your fathers have set. This is a verse that has recently come to mind, I would say just in the last few weeks. And you know, when you're maybe thinking about a message and then you get a verse and you're wondering, why did you get that verse? How's it going to fit? What's the purpose? And then through the week, I don't know if we're looking for things to help explain it, but it just seemed to happen for me in the last week or so. A whole bunch of pieces fell into place all around this topic of Proverbs 22, verse 28. Do not remove the ancient landmark which your fathers have set. It's a pretty easy verse to understand. There's not a lot here. Do not remove. Okay, what does that mean? Leave it where it is. It's already there. What about an ancient boundary? That's a line that marks the limit, which was set in place a long time ago. It's ancient and it's a line, and it's marking out a specific area. And who put it there? It's the fathers have set it. So that's a reference to our forefathers, to those who have gone before. I'd like to take a look at the context for this verse, talk a little bit about inheritance and what these ancient boundaries are, the importance of it, and then also the consequences if one gets moved. It seems very important to the writer here that these boundaries shouldn't get moved, so we should look at what would happen if they actually did. So for the context, it really, it's the children of Israel. When they had left Egypt and were coming into the promised land, into Canaan, they drove out the people that were in the land and they claimed it as their own, right? This was according to the promises of God to Abraham. Once they'd driven the people out, they set out these borders and boundaries, and they divided it up by the 12 tribes, and then those areas were divided smaller into the families, right? And the purpose was to establish a border, to set a limit, to draw this clear line to define an area. I think we're all pretty familiar with borders. I'm sure everybody here on this meeting this morning has gotten their vehicle and went to cross over into the United States. Maybe not in the last 12 months, but prior to that. And when you got there, there's a wall, there's a fence, there's guards, and you have to give your information, you have to talk to somebody. It's a pretty clearly defined boundary. I remember in high school hearing a story from my woodwork teacher, just a real class A gentleman, Mr. J. And they used to go snowmobiling down in the South Okanagan in the Ashnola area. And there, the border was not very well defined. So one day, as they were all on their sleds and they were cruising along into the mountains, much to their astonishment, two military helicopters showed up over the loudspeaker, let them know that they had crossed over from Canada into the United States, and then very kindly and graciously offered to escort them back across to the other side. So borders, there was a border there, but it was not very clear. They weren't really able to see that it was actually there. Deuteronomy 19, verse 14, it says this: "You shall not move your neighbor's boundary mark, which the ancestors have set in your inheritance, which you will inherit in the land that the Lord your God gives you to possess." For the people of Israel, the land is very, very important to them, and especially the piece that they have as their inheritance in their family. It was something that stayed in the family, and it was passed from generation to generation. The borders were established, very, very important to them. They didn't have a right to move them from their place. And that's the same here. That's the point we're trying to make, that I'm going to try and make this morning from this text, is there's borders and boundaries that have been put in place, and it's not my right to move them. So let's talk for just a second about inheritance. Borders, we all have a pretty good idea what that is. And same thing with inheritance. It's money or property. It's an asset, something that's received from a person who has died. And often there will be a ring or a family heirloom, and it's been passed from generation to generation to generation. And it's really important to the family to have these pieces remembrances from the past. I was thinking this morning of what has been passed down to us in our generation from those who have gone before when it comes to Christian living and assembly testimony. I would say we are rich in our generation because of those who have gone before, what they have established, and what has been passed down to us. Back in 2019 at an oversight meeting, there was discussion on the purpose of a local church, right? We wanted to focus our efforts to do some planning and have just kind of an alignment on a common purpose. So the question that we asked to get this discussion going was, why does a local church exist? And we used this question to sort of frame the conversation for everything that we were doing as a local church, right? We sure do a lot in the past, especially very, very busy, this local group of Christians. And it's so important, but why is the local church really here? Why does it exist? You know what answer we arrived at to that question? It wasn't anything brand new, but we framed it like this: to fulfill the scriptural mission of a local church so that God may be glorified, his people will grow, and the neighbors will be won. This threefold focus. And we found the whole exercise very, very valuable. Not that it revealed to us anything new or revolutionary, but it was a good, solid reset. The purpose was not to redo and throw out the old, no, but rather to reestablish and capture and build upon what is already in place. And this is the point that I'm trying to make around our inheritance, this spiritual inheritance that's been passed down to us. We build on the shoulders of those who have gone before us. I already mentioned in our generation, we are in a very privileged position, and we are benefiting from the work that's previously done. There's a famous quote: "Burdens carried yesterday have paved the way for today." That is so true for us. But along with that privilege also comes the responsibility. You and I in our generation today have the responsibility now to preserve and carry over for the generation that's coming after us. It's well understood that anytime there is a transition point, that there's potential for something to be lost. In the manufacturing world, it's the handoff between machine centers. In the business world, it's the handoff between departments. In logistics, it's the handoff between carriers. And in the church, one of the biggest transitions is the handoff between generations. Interestingly, the local church is on the verge of a different transition right now. Not one between generations, but a transition brought on by the pandemic. Right? We were moved abruptly from regular activities, responsibilities, the accountabilities, the spheres of service to lockdown, no meetings, suspended activities, minimal accountability. Thankfully, a new normal, resilience, right, has been established where we're able to meet online like this. The gospel is being shared, and we have opportunities to be exposed to teaching, even from preachers around the world on a more regular basis, like last Sunday with Stephen Grand. But now, as things seem to maybe be opening up again, we're preparing again to transition back to face-to-face assembly meetings and regular type outreach. So when I use that phrase, opportunity for things to get lost during transition, it kind of has a negative connotation. But it is a negative if things are lost. But there's also a positive piece to that, right? It's equally important is that there's an opportunity to learn. So as we move back to more traditional practices and behaviors, there's going to be some rebuilding, right? Rebuilding is going to be required. There's things that have been lost maybe in the last year. Maybe new habits have formed and things have shifted. So two things are going to be required. We're going to need to exercise extreme caution to ensure that none of the critical pieces are lost. But additionally, we're going to need wisdom, and we're thankful for our Father who gives to us wisdom so that we can have opportunity for any learnings to be incorporated, learnings that will not take away from the past. So let's get back to our text here, Proverbs 22 and 28. Do not remove the ancient landmarks. How does this fit into what we're talking about? So not moving the landmarks is important. But if we're not going to move them, we first need to understand where they are located. The first step is establish the boundary. Clarify where the lines have been drawn. So my brother Nathan, he recently bought some property. And one of the first things that he and Dad did was to identify the pins that marked out the boundary of that property. They had a blueprint of the area. So, it looked good on paper. They had a general idea of the property, based on geographic features. So, to the eye, a general sense. But it wasn't until the property pins could be identified that there was really this confidence exactly what and where the property actually was. To find those pins, it involved a bunch of work, metal detector, digging, searching, and they found a few, but there were some that were missing. They'd been moved. They were gone. Well, this could have been a real opportunity for Nathan. No pin? He could have set that pin wherever he wanted. Maybe added on an extra meter or two or a couple feet. No one would know. No, he can't do that. There was a specific place the pin needed to go to mark the boundary and establish the line. Even though the pin was missing, the line was still there. So it involved a lot more work. Several reference points working together to arrive at the right spot. Tape measures, the neighbor's pins, road allowances, and all these different things were used to now find the right place where the pin needed to be. This example, it's just an attempt to highlight the importance of establishing the borders of assembly life and activities in the right spot. So what tools do we have at our disposal? We have the traditional, right? How we've done it before, what we know, what we're comfortable with. That will be an important tool, but it's not a standalone. And then there's the practical. What makes sense logically for the Lord's people? That will also be important, but it's not a standalone. And then there's the scriptural tool. This one is really, really critical, that the pins are established based on the word of God. So these three working together will help us as a local company to reestablish the lines as we gather together again face to face. There's three pins we need to get right. Our upward focus. So I'm talking about worship. The assembly is the dwelling place of God. It's the meeting place of Christ with the local Christians. Our relationship with our God, how we function as a local company with our upward focus, we need to get that right. And then the inward piece, right? That's the care for the Christians, the teaching, the building up, the shepherding, the growing, right? And then the outward focus, that's the gospel. That's the practical outreach. It's that scheduled interaction with the community to bring the gospel to those who need to hear it. So three focuses: upward, inward, and outward. And we need to get these three pins right. I think there's also a personal application, aside from the local church one, that is fairly obvious for us to draw. And it's worth talking about. It's possible that there were pins in my life or in yours that have gone missing or have been covered up in the last 12 months. The boundary that was so clear before is now breached on a more regular basis, or where that pin is located, there's just become a bit of a more fuzzy understanding. And that's dangerous. So we're going to talk about consequences in a minute. And there's consequences to this. But they can be reestablished. It's going to require some effort to relocate them. But like we learned from Nathan, the example of Nathan's property, it's possible. Even if not initially straightforward, we have the Bible, we have traditional what's happened before, and we have the practical piece that we can use to reestablish the pins in our own life and when it comes to local assembly truth. The Bible blueprint, that's going to be the main piece for us. So let's talk about consequences. Sometimes boundaries and lines that are drawn, they're looked at as restrictive. Hey, that is a limitation on my liberty. And in one sense, yes, it is true. Lines do bring in restrictions. But the question that came to me is this: is it a limitation of liberty in Christ? Or is it liberty of self that is being restricted? Because there's a really big difference. Established boundaries, although they may be perceived as limiting, they're actually a major safeguard. They give us clear lines of expectations and accountability, and they preserve us from going astray or from being attacked. You know, one time, a long time ago, and I don't remember the year, I was at an Easter conference and Jack Hunter was there and he was preaching, and I wasn't a believer, but I remember the palpable feeling in that congregation as this man took the platform and he read this verse in Ecclesiastes chapter 10. When he stood up, he said something to the effect of, I had a message planned, but I just couldn't give it. And I got a niggle that I should speak on this verse. And it stood out to me. This is a long time ago. And this is the verse, Ecclesiastes 10, verse 8. The one who breaks a hedge or a border, a serpent will bite him. There is consequence involved for the believer when we take ourselves outside of the protective boundaries that God has outlined and put in place for us. And this is an abiding principle in every generation. You know, if we want to do something, it's easy to find justification for almost any activity we want to do. But if it goes against the clear Bible commands or even Bible guidelines, then we can expect to feel the sting of the serpent's bite and the ensuing consequences. I follow this guy. He's a brilliant man, and I read his blog. His name is James Clear, and he had a quote from Franz Brentano this week on his newsletter. So listen to this. It fits so well. What is at first small is often extremely large in the end. And so it happens that whoever deviates only a little from truth in the beginning is led farther afield in the sequel, and to errors which are 1,000 times as large. Although it's not nice to talk about consequences, I feel like it's important, because it helps us as individuals to take stock of what is at stake. And we do it a lot when we share the gospel as well, right? We talk about the benefits, but then we also talk about the consequence, because it really frames it for what is actually on the table. Here's another example. So yesterday morning, I was having a nice early coffee on the deck, and Dad was working with the tractor, and he was getting some stuff set up. And his dog Sheba was out doing her morning laps of the property, reestablishing her dominance. So the orchard is fully fenced, and she does her laps around on the inside. But there's this one spot where some vines have grown up and they've pulled the fence lower. And then on the other side, there's a pile of stumps, so it really doesn't look like much of a fence at all. Well, as can be expected, her eye turned to wider pastures, and with an effortless leap, she cleared the fence, and she was now out in the great unknown. It was interesting to me like this fence, it's been there for her whole life. And yes, she's gotten out before, but it really didn't actually restrain her. It was just this marker border. And if she had wanted to, she could have cleared it a long time ago. But here she goes this morning. She's out and she clears the fence. Isn't that the same for you and I today? Bible-based borders are there, but if we want, we can just easily move past them, especially if we lose sight of why they are there in the first place. You know, for Sheba, it was beautiful. Like, watch her, she just really stretched out. Head was up, legs were going, her tail was raised, and she's cruising down the asphalt. I can even hear the pads of her feet just lightly scuff as she just motored on down the road. Your freedom at last. It's not that what she had before was bad, but this was just so new and exciting, and you could just tell it. It was written all over her body language, her dog language. But then came the one-ton Dodge round the corner, 75 kilometers an hour. So like a true watchdog, she gets into position to defend her turf. But it's not her turf. This road belongs to the Dodge, and she's in the danger zone, way out of her league. But she lowers her head and she makes her run. The Dodge continues on unchecked. Like just the last minute, Sheba veers off and narrowly avoids total catastrophe. What's the lesson? She is in a domain that, although may be very exciting, is fraught with danger. Remember Ecclesiastes? Whoever breaks a hedge, a serpent will bite him. Ephesians 6 verse 12 reminds us our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. When we take ourselves outside of the boundaries of the Bible and the lines that God has drawn, we're putting ourselves in the danger zone. You know, I watched Sheba after that point try to find her way back, but she couldn't see it. The gates were closed. The route that she had taken out, she couldn't see her way through to get back that way. I tried to talk to her, to coax her, but she was very untrusting of me, and she ran off again. Eventually, Nathan went down and he opened up the main gate, and 15 minutes later, she saw her way clear to return. 2 points that I think we can learn from this. The conclusion for my parents and their dog was not to reestablish the border of the property so that Sheba could have more space. Do you catch my point? The fence was not moved to expand or accommodate her interests. I think that's an important lesson. But then another one, a little bit more of a heartwarming one. She couldn't see her way back until the gate was open. There was a warm welcome for the one who had wandered. Through this pandemic, through this last year, there is a risk that with the transition and the things that have happened, that individual pins have moved. We're going to need to reestablish those. When it comes to assembly life, to re-clarify what are we doing to focus, to rebuild, but also to make sure that we are able to welcome back and entice back maybe any who have wandered. And this piece stuck out to me because when I tried to talk to the dog, to get her attention, to help her, to show her the way, she didn't want to hear it. And I was being very sweet, I was whistling, I was coaxing, but the time wasn't right. In her mind, she was not there mentally. I could have shouted, I could have ran, could have tried to scare her. It also wouldn't have worked. And I think that's just one piece that we need to keep in mind as we begin to regather and reset up in our face-to-face meetings, that we want everybody back. And it's going to just take a little bit of wisdom and time and coaxing, but the individuals are going to need to see their way back, see their home in the assembly in West Bank, where all of us will be meeting together again with the Lord. So of course, though, the fence, the part that's drooped, there's going to need to be a little bit of repair there, right? Just so as to not invite another exit from the same spot. My summary comments: whether you're 15, 50, or 75, the instruction from our text is to pay attention and to respect the boundaries. Hard work has been done by generations before us to establish them and to build upon them. And that is our responsibility as well, to maintain them, reestablish if need be, but to continue to build and not lose sight of our three-pronged focus: upward, inward, and outward. Maybe I'll just pray.